opens up diagonals for the queen and bishop, immediately contesting the center and creating dynamic possibilities. Embracing asymmetrical pawn structures immediately, black disrupts white's central ambitions and prepares an aggressive flank assault. Developing a knight towards the center immediately challenges black's pawn structure and prepares for rapid queenside expansion. Developing the knight to c6 is a standard, flexible response, reinforcing control of the d4 square and preparing for further development. Challenging the center immediately, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and gain a dynamic advantage in space. Accepting the pawn sacrifice opens lines, so be ready for white's initiative. Recapturing the pawn immediately opens lines and brings the knight to a central outpost, dictating the game's dynamic flow. Developing the knight to a natural square, this move challenges white's central pawn and prepares for castling, offering excellent dynamic potential. A swift occupation of the center solidifies white's territorial advantage, threatening a central pawn push. Instantly, the Sicilian is injected with sharp central pawn tension, daring white to confront the advancing e-pawn. A bold foray, the knight now occupies a square that disrupts black's pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable f7 square, creating immediate tactical possibilities while simultaneously challenging black's central control and potentially forcing concessions. Asserting central influence, d6 liberates the light-squared bishop and prepares for potential. a6 and b5 advances, contesting the knight's forward perch. It's a fundamental pawn structure decision setting the stage for positional maneuvering. Unpinning the knight by developing the bishop is a classic Sicilian dragon maneuver, immediately aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for an aggressive kingside assault. Pushing that pawn to a6 forcefully challenges white's advanced knight, aiming to dislodge it and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it does create a slight pawn weakness on the queen side. Steering the knight to the edge feels like a temporary concession of central influence, aiming to provoke a less harmonious pawn structure for black after the inevitable b5 advance. Asserting queenside presence, black immediately challenges white's knight and seeks to expand. This pawn push ignites a fight for space on the flank, potentially opening lines for black's rooks while simultaneously pressuring white's advanced knight. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines for your pieces and creates structural weaknesses for black's pawn chain, a bold decision that can lead to dynamic play. Opening the g-file for your king is a significant positional concession, creating inherent weaknesses that can be exploited later if white can bring pieces to bear on that area. The knight now establishes a formidable outpost on d5, immediately threatening the weakened kingside pawn structure and creating a strategic imbalance by harassing the black knight on c6. Undermining white's central knight with the pawn thrust opens lines but weakens the kingside structure. Be prepared for immediate counterplay. Developing the bishop to d3 solidifies control over the central dark squares and prepares for a potential kingside attack, while also keeping a watchful eye on the c4 diagonal, a subtle but important influence in the unfolding positional struggle. Black fortifies the pawn chain's advanced route and prepares to activate the queen's bishop, aiming to counter white's kingside pressure by unbalancing the central structure and potentially opening lines for counterplay. Securing the monarch by tucking it away behind pawns initiates a phase of relative stability, aiming to consolidate the pieces for future action and deny black any immediate predatory opportunities. Initiating an exchange to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain an open g-file for the rook creates immediate counterplay. This decision, while seemingly exchanging a bishop for a knight, strategically weakens white's kingside pawn cover and opens lines that could prove critical later. The newfound central pawn vacuum forces white to reconsider their development, potentially creating opportunities for black to seize initiative through pawn advancements or piece activity. Consider how this pawn structure shift impacts the long-term prospects for both sides' king safety and piece maneuvering. Unleashing the open e-file offers a fascinating prospect, immediately challenging black's central pawn chain and forcing a decision on how to handle the isolated d6 pawn. White's pawn structure now possesses a dynamic potential, promising long-term attacking avenues, though it does create a slight structural weakness on the queen side. Black must carefully consider the repercussions of this pawn push, as it significantly alters the board's equilibrium and opens up opportunities for White's pieces to infiltrate. The immediate question is whether Black can adequately defend the weak d6 square without sacrificing further positional concessions. This move injects a dose of tactical sharpness into an already complex Sicilian battle. Emerging from the pawn chain's congestion, Black's knight seeks a less restrictive square, aiming to influence the king side and potentially support future pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential queenside expansion, this pawn thrust aims to establish a stable pawn chain, though it does concede a slight central outpost to Black's knight. Unleashing the bishop towards the king side is a promising territorial claim, eyeing the potential weaknesses created by White's pawn structure after the knight's retreat. Unleashing the queen towards the king side, White creates immediate tension, threatening a potential discovered attack on the castled monarch if Black isn't careful with their pawn structure. This aggressively positions White's most powerful piece, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed Black king and the weakened kingside created by 9. Bxf6. The strategic intent is clear: to apply pressure and force concessions, potentially opening lines for further assault or creating tactical traps that Black might stumble into. Consider how this queen maneuver might influence the development of other pieces and the potential pawn pushes that could follow. Black bravely challenges the center with this pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt White's knight on d5 and open diagonals for his own pieces, particularly the bishop on g7. This aggressive pawn push creates immediate central tension, forcing White to react and potentially defining the pawn structure for the ensuing middle game. It's a bold move, sacrificing some positional soundness for dynamic counterplay, with the potential to liberate Black's kingside and launch an attack if White isn't careful. Shifting the bishop to e2 prepares to reinforce the kingside and potentially launch an attack down the g-file, all while sidestepping the newly created e4 outpost for Black's pawn. Focusing on central pawn control and preparing a sortie for the queen, this maneuver by Black aims to establish a more active role for the royal lady amidst White's kingside pressure. The queenside development, though delayed, now seeks to leverage the open c-file and potentially eye the enemy king should White's own defenses falter. This could be a bid to contest White's initiative by creating counterplay and forcing White to consider defensive measures. Opening the central, a file for potential rook incursions now that Black's pawn structure is compromised, aims to exploit the weakened kingside and create immediate tactical possibilities. Black opts for a dynamic pawn push, aiming to disrupt White's central control and potentially open lines. The knight's repositioning on g6, while seemingly passive, serves the dual purpose of defending the f-pawn and preparing for potential counterplay on the kingside or center. This move challenges White's queen and hints at an aggressive intent, forcing White to reevaluate their attacking plans. The resulting pawn structure will be crucial, and Black is clearly willing to accept some structural concessions to achieve active piece play. Opening up the kingside for potential attacks, White signals an intention to exploit Black's slightly exposed monarch. Anchoring the king now secures a vital sanctuary, offering respite from the central skirmishes and preparing for future counterplay. Shifting the knight from the active central square to the flank, preparing to defend the potentially vulnerable kingside pawn structure, and redeploying the knight to a more supportive role on the kingside, perhaps targeting the d6 pawn or reinforcing the kingside defense. Shifting forces to the kingside assault, Re8 readies the rook for potential involvement in the central e-file push, or an opportunistic sortie via the g-file if the White king's shelter crumbles, while also unblocking the g7 bishop's diagonal, hinting at a future repositioning or defense. Refocusing the cavalry to the kingside demonstrates a shift in White's attention, aiming to bolster the monarch's defenses and prepare for a potential assault on the weakened Black king. Black bravely challenges the centralized knight, seeking to untangle their pieces and exploit the open e-file. This aggressive posture, however, risks creating weaknesses on the kingside, as the defender must now be keenly aware of potential tactical threats arising from White's reshaped pawn structure. The queen's sudden repositioning to h3, abandoning her post on g5, signals a potential shift in white's attack, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened kingside diagonal and perhaps prepare a pawn push or a knight maneuver towards the center or black's king. Confronting the queen's aggressive encroachment, black centralizes the queen, seeking to coordinate with the rook on the open e-file and prepare for potential pawn breaks. This retreat allows black's pieces to breathe and potentially consolidate their position, a far cry from the pressure white might have hoped to maintain by keeping the knight on the more active c3 square. Instead, the knight finds itself somewhat passive, a defensive sentinel that could be outmaneuvered. Consider how this repositioning might invite black to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king, or perhaps to prepare a dynamic pawn push that further restricts white's development. The pawn storm erupts on the kingside, aiming to shatter white's king's defense and open crucial lines for black's pieces. Swapping queens now, after black's committed pawn push, sacrifices white's potential initiative for a tidier pawn structure and aims to exploit the exposed kingside in the ensuing endgame. The rook now occupies the freed-up file, a natural and active repositioning after the queen trade, aiming to exploit the open lines that have materialized. Unleashing a pawn thrust like this risks creating permanent weaknesses in white's kingside structure, particularly on the dark squares, which could become a significant target later. Unleashing the pawn structure for a potential queenside initiative, this capture opens up the f-file, which might soon become a hotly contested avenue for counterplay. Reclaiming the bishop after the exchange opens up the king's diagonal and aims to reactivate white's pieces, potentially targeting the weakened kingside pawn structure. The pawn structure around black's king has been irrevocably damaged, opening crucial lines for white's pieces to exploit. Opening the h-file, white immediately exposes black's king to potential pressure, a crucial factor now that the queens have been exchanged and the pawn structure around the monarch has been compromised. This aggressive step aims to exploit the weakness created by black's pawn push, potentially leading to an attack down the semi-open file, and the subsequent pawn structure around black's king is now extremely porous. Relinquishing the d-file opens up lines for white's rook, forcing black to immediately defend. This decision to reroute the rook, while seemingly passive, aims to find a safer haven for it and prepare for potential counterplay on the kingside, anticipating white's rooks might eye the g-file. Reclaiming the initiative, this maneuver seeks to exploit the now open b-file, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the exposed king. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's knight outpost and create opportunities on the queenside. Asserting a firm outpost for the knight, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and gain vital central space. Challenging white's central control, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt the knight's established outpost and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces. Opening the c-file for your rook promises significant pressure on black's weakened kingside, especially since their pieces are so poorly coordinated. Unlocking the queenside with a pawn thrust, black immediately challenges the advanced knight and seizes a foothold on the 7th rank. Opening up the d-file now presents a direct pathway for the rook to become active, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure, particularly the isolated c-pawn once it advances. The knight's bold leap to e5 aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure after the recent exchanges, hinting at an immediate initiative. Asserting control over the critical c-file opens up attacking avenues and restricts black's pieces. A bold foray into enemy territory, this knight's advance ignites fascinating tactical possibilities, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and aiming to exploit the awkwardness of the a6 pawn. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now, b3* aims to create a safe haven for the knight on c6, preventing its immediate expulsion by black's active pawns and preparing to potentially advance the queenside majority later. Seizing the open file with the rook dramatically reshapes the tactical landscape, promising future pressure on white's king. Securing that knight on d3 becomes paramount. The bishop retreats to a defensive post, eyeing the compromised kingside. a bold thrust into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. The king bravely ventures into the fray, seeking shelter and perhaps a more active role as the queens depart, initiating a potential endgame where kings often become powerful attacking pieces, demanding a careful assessment of his newfound safety. Aha, finally the bishop awakens from its slumber on g7 to assert a presence on the long diagonal, eyeing that exposed white king. The bishop sacrifices itself here, a bold gambit to disrupt black's encroaching knight and potentially open a pathway for the rook, though it does leave white's kingside somewhat exposed for the moment. The rook now occupies a central outpost, disrupting white's pawn structure and threatening further incursions along the third rank, creating a potent attacking force that demands white's immediate attention and careful defense. Reasserting central influence and activating the rook, by bringing it to the fourth rank after a forced exchange aims to contest the open files and disrupt black's potential coordination. A desperate gambit to disrupt white's centralized king and potentially create complications along the now open d-file, though it concedes a significant tempo loss for the rook. The king's unexpected foray to the center, shielded by weakened pawns, now offers a tempting target for the relentless advance of black's rook. Recapturing the bishop opens a critical diagonal for black's remaining rook, potentially leading to a swift invasion down the seventh rank. Reclaiming the open file presents a fresh opportunity for white to improve piece activity and potentially create passed pawns, but attention must remain on preventing black's advanced pieces from gaining further initiative. The bishop's repositioning to c3 completes the clearing of the d-file for the rook, and simultaneously prepares to contest the vital a-file, opening up potential breakthroughs for the queen's side pawns. Gaining access to the seventh rank with the knight, this check disrupts black's pawn structure and forces an immediate, unfavorable exchange. The king bravely ventures back into the fray, seeking to support its beleaguered pawns and perhaps even initiate counterplay in a complicated material situation where white holds an extra knight. Reclaiming the outpost on e7 is a brilliant idea, forcing a reevaluation of the piece positioning and potentially limiting black's attacking scope. Re-establishing piece activity after the capture and counter-capture on the queen side becomes paramount, activating that bishop on e5 eyes open territory. Repositioning the rook to the open file solidifies control and prepares for potential advances. The king, now exposed after the queen trade, seeks refuge by heading back towards the queen side, a sensible retreat to avoid further tactical complications stemming from the knight's aggressive outpost. Reactivating the king for a centralized role in the endgame, aiming to support the knight and exploit the open d-file. The king tentatively steps out from behind the pawn wall, a bold but perhaps premature venture, aiming to centralize and avoid the menacing knight and bishop battery. Shifting the rook to the second rank, now aims to capitalize on black's misplaced knight and potential weaknesses around the king. Pushing the h-pawn forward creates a critical weakness on the king side, offering white's rook a clear infiltration square on the seventh rank. Securing the seventh rank after the preceding exchange presents an immediate opportunity to solidify defensive structures and prepare for pawn advances. Sensing an opportunity to exploit white's misplaced knight, black aims to activate his rook along the open file. Securing the advanced knight on g2 now prevents any immediate complications for your king and prepares to consolidate your improved piece activity, potentially aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's monarch or reinforce your own central control. Shifting the rook from the g-file to the g-file allows it to probe the now open h-file, potentially creating threats against the white king's defenses. Relocating the knight to a more active square, this maneuver aims to challenge black's control of the central files and potentially support a future kingside initiative. Repositioning the bishop to the fourth rank activates it along the long diagonal and aims to contest control of the d-file, a crucial pathway in this somewhat closed middle game struggle. Redeploying the knight to c2 aims to potentially reroute it to d4 or b4, seeking to exploit the newly opened central files after the pawn exchange and create new attacking possibilities. Finally, bringing that bishop back into the fray, aiming to reclaim some central influence after a period of relative quiet on that front. Shifting the rook to the d-file immediately contests the open file and sets up a potential pressure point against black's central pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing to reposition the rook to a more active square if the opportunity arises. The rook's descent to the first rank aims to disrupt white's defensive setup, directly challenging the king and potentially forcing a more passive response than previously enjoyed. Stepping back to consolidate the king's safety becomes paramount after the rook's persistent probing. Repositioning towards the center offers better defensive coverage against potential future checks and allows for coordination with remaining pieces as the endgame looms, preparing to contest central squares or defend against pawn advances. Relocating the king to the center of the board now is a bold maneuver, potentially opening lines for counterplay, but also exposing it to further checks and threats along the open files. Repositioning the knight to its original square might seem passive, but it prepares to re-engage in the central skirmish or potentially swing over to the kingside if black's pawn advances become too aggressive. A decisive moment approaches as black seeks to solidify their king's position, moving it towards the center to potentially participate in the endgame action or defend against any lingering threats. Reasserting control over the central files, the knight maneuvers back to a more active square, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially set up a more favorable exchange. Reactivating the king's central presence is a bold maneuver, seeking to exploit any positional imbalances as the material thins out and the endgame beckons. Hoping to dislodge the pesky knight and perhaps open lines for its own pieces, white initiates a pawn advance. The rook's repositioning to the fifth rank offers an immediate threat to white's center pawns, and subtly prepares to contest control of the e-file should it open further. Repositioning the knight to f3 reestablishes a defensive post, preparing to potentially swing towards g5 or h4 to support the king if black's rook makes further incursions. Pivoting the rook to the third rank aims to disrupt white's defensive structure and potentially create infiltration opportunities, forcing the opponent to react to this active repositioning. Reactivating the knight to the central outpost now exerts pressure on black's rather exposed bishop. The black king, finally escaping the pawn chain's constraints, seeks refuge on the kingside, aiming for the h5 square as a potential safety net. Reactivating the knight to c2 aims to re-establish a defensive screen for the king and potentially shift its focus to the queen side, but it ignores the growing pressure black exerts on the d-file and the exposed white king. The rook on c3 now aims to exploit the open of file, creating pressure against the uncastled king and potentially forcing concessions for white's knight. The knight retreats to its starting square, seemingly a step backward, but this is a subtle repositioning, aiming to challenge the black bishop on c5. White is preparing to contest the d-file and potentially activate the bishop on d3 for a later attack or defense of the kingside. It's a waiting maneuver, allowing black to reveal their intentions with their next move while white consolidates their position. The black king boldly steps out to embrace the action, seeking central influence and potential activation against white's somewhat passive setup. Repositioning the knight to f3 aims to reinforce the d4 square and potentially prepare for a kingside advance, though the pawn structure remains somewhat compromised. An attempt to break the stranglehold on the central squares, freeing the knight to seek more active squares. Reactivating the rook to the second rank revitalizes white's attacking potential, aiming to reposition it to a more threatening square. The king boldly ventures out, seeking active participation in the endgame's strategic ballet. The knight's repositioning aims to disrupt black's bishop pair and potentially eye weaknesses on the kingside. Harnessing the king's newly awakened offensive potential, black bravely ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats by leveraging the open lines that have emerged. The knight's repositioning to f5 aims to exploit the potentially weakened kingside structure after black's recent pawn advances, eyeing squares like g7 or h6, while simultaneously bolstering defense against any counterplay along the g-file. Finally redirecting the bishop's attention back to the kingside, aiming to exert pressure along that diagonal and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure or create weaknesses around the enemy monarch.